Before we begin, do you have a theory about this case or a story of your own? Leave a message on our socials. Our handles are all just Nightwatch Files without the space, or head over to nightwatchfiles.com to find them all in one place. Your insights might be featured in a future episode. I'm Harper Finley, and this is Nightwatch Files. Quick note, if you enjoy the show and want to support it continuing, we have a Patreon that goes for just $3 a month. You'll get ad-free access to every episode, and you can now listen to them on Spotify and Apple Podcasts as a Patreon supporter. Whether you want to help keep the show going or just prefer listening without ads, you can find the links in the episode description. Now, let's get into today's case. At 12:15 in the afternoon on October 31st, 1975, 15-year-old Sheila McGuire was walking through a wooded section of her neighbor's property in Belle Haven, Connecticut. It was a shortcut the neighborhood children used all the time, cutting between the grand homes that lined the exclusive enclave where Greenwich's wealthiest families lived, behind manicured hedges and old money. Sheila was on her way to see if her friend Martha wanted to go downtown. The two girls had plans. It was the day after Mischief Night, and the neighborhood was still recovering from the previous evening's pranks. Toilet paper in trees, eggs splattered on driveways, the harmless chaos of suburban teenagers celebrating Halloween. Walking across the yard, Sheila noticed something lying beneath a large pine tree about 200 feet from the house. At first, she thought it was a sleeping bag on top of a foam mattress. Someone camping out, maybe. Kids did strange things after Halloween. She stepped closer. Then she saw her friend. Martha was lying face down beneath the low-hanging boughs of the pine tree. She was still wearing her blue down jacket, open over a white flower print turtleneck. Her blue jeans and panties were pulled down below her knees. Her head was covered in dried blood. Her eyes were closed. Sheila ran. Within minutes, police would arrive. Within hours, detectives would find pieces of a broken golf club near the body, the head of a 6-iron, and 2 pieces of shaft. By that same afternoon, they would trace the golf club to a set owned by the family who lived across the street. A wealthy, connected family with ties to one of America's most powerful political dynasties. The investigation that followed would span 50 years. It would involve changed alibis, failed polygraphs, leaked files, grand juries, a conviction, and multiple reversals. It would expose the limits of justice when wealth and privilege create walls that investigators cannot penetrate. But before any of that, there was a girl lying beneath a tree. And the question that would haunt Greenwich, Connecticut for half a century: who killed Martha Moxley? In 1892, George Jordan Skakel Sr. was born in Chicago, Illinois. His beginnings were modest. He started working as a railroad clerk, earning just $8 a week. But George had ambition. He partnered with others to build a coal and coke business, establishing the Great Lakes Coal and Coke Company. Over time, this venture evolved into the Great Lakes Carbon Corporation, transforming it into one of the largest privately held corporations in the country. By the 1930s, the Skakel fortune was firmly established. In 1936, George and his wife, Anne Brannack, purchased a large English manor-style home in Greenwich, Connecticut. The property signaled their arrival into affluent society. Here, they raised their 7 children in an environment of privilege and opportunity. George was Protestant, Anne was a devout Catholic, and their differing faiths shaped the family's cultural and religious identity. The Skakel children attended prestigious private schools. Ethel, born in 1928 as the 6th of 7 children, went to Greenwich Academy and later the Convent of the Sacred Heart in New York. The children spent summers and holidays with other wealthy families across the Northeast, moving through the social circles of America's elite. It was during these years that Ethel formed a close friendship with Gene Kennedy, The two became college roommates, creating a bond that would eventually bridge two powerful families. In 1950, Ethel Skakel married Robert F. Kennedy, brother of future President John F. Kennedy. Robert was a rising political figure who would go on to serve as U.S. Attorney General and later as a New York Senator. The marriage thrust the Skakels from the world of business and local society into the glare of national politics. Media attention intensified. Public scrutiny followed. Ethel and Robert had 11 children together, weaving the Skakel bloodline permanently into the Kennedy legacy. Meanwhile, George Skakel's sons grew up under the weight of their father's fortune and their sister's political prominence. Rushton Skakel Sr. inherited substantial wealth. He married Anne Reynolds and settled in the Belle Haven enclave of Greenwich, an exclusive neighborhood where the affluent lived behind gates and manicured hedges. They also had 7 children. In 1965, George and Anne's 4-year-old son Thomas Skakel suffered a severe head injury. He had jumped from a moving car, an impulsive act that resulted in linear fractures on both sides of his skull. A neurologist performed emergency surgery. According to later assessments by Sutton Associates, doctors concluded that the injury had caused lasting mental and emotional problems. The incident marked Thomas as damaged in ways that would shadow him through childhood. Thanksgiving Day 1966 brought another tragedy to the Skakel orbit. Kik Skakel, the eldest daughter of George Jr. and Pat Caroon Skakel, was driving her brand-new Mustang convertible through the neighborhood with the top down. Several young children were sitting on the trunk lid, laughing in the November air. When the car hit a speed bump, 6-year-old Hope O'Brien flew off the back, landing hard on her head. She died a week later. Greenwich Police Chief Stephen Barron blamed the speed bumps for her death. The Skakels' insurance company eventually settled with the O'Briens for $25,000. The incidents accumulated like pressure behind a dam. The family's wealth provided no immunity from chaos or consequence. It simply provided better lawyers and quieter resolutions. By the early 1970s, the Skakel family occupied a paradoxical space in American society. They were ensconced in the upper echelons, members of exclusive clubs, connected to political royalty, living in one of the wealthiest towns in the nation. Yet within the family, there was turbulence, substance abuse, early deaths, the ever-present shadow of the Kennedy tragedies. Greenwich, Connecticut was a place where old money met new ambition, where privacy was valued and appearances carefully maintained. The Skakels fit seamlessly into this world, their lives shaped by mid-20th century ideals of enterprise and achievement. But beneath that polished surface, cracks were forming, cracks that would soon be impossible to ignore. For Michael Skakel, the years between 1971 and 1974 marked the descent from troubled child to something darker. He was the 5th of 7 children born to Rushton Walter Skakel and Anne Reynolds. The defining rupture came in 1973 when Michael's mother died of cancer. Michael turned 13 that September. He later wrote that an even more intense level of chaos came to rule our household after her death. The structure that had barely existed before collapsed entirely. The children lived without meaningful adult supervision, adrift in a house full of money but empty of guidance. Family friends who visited noted the absence of boundaries, the sense that no one was truly in charge. Michael's response to his mother's death was to reach for alcohol. He described developing full-blown daily drinking alcoholism from the age of 13. What began as teenage experimentation quickly became compulsion. By his own account, alcohol became his constant companion through adolescence. Those who knew the Skakel children described Michael as the wildest of them all. He and his older brother Thomas were, by several accounts, by far the worst of the boys. Michael was undisciplined, out of control, careening through his teenage years with little regard for consequence. He drank heavily, he fought with his brothers, he threatened other family members. His temperament was volatile. He had what people called a hair-trigger temper that could ignite without warning. High-strung and hyperactive, Michael seemed always on the edge of something. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Michael's cousin, would later describe him as a sensitive child trapped in a harsh environment. Rushton Skakel was alcoholic and, by multiple accounts, violent. Neighbors and family members recalled a home where dysfunction simmered beneath the veneer of privilege. Later, Michael would chronicle what he called his family's disjointed, sick-rich lifestyle. He characterized himself as the family scapegoat, the one who bore the brunt of his father's rage. He recounted being beaten by Rushton and by his brother Tommy. The violence was casual, routine, accepted. School provided no refuge. Michael was a poor student, struggling through institutions that eventually gave up on him. He would reportedly flunk out of a dozen schools over the years, each expulsion another marker of his inability to function within normal boundaries. His dyslexia remained undiagnosed, his frustration mounting with each failed attempt at academic success. In the summer of 1974, new neighbors moved into Belle Haven. The Moxley family took up residence in the neighborhood, bringing with them a teenage daughter named Martha. She would arrive just as Michael Skakel's world was spinning furthest out of control, just as the household at the Skakel residence had settled into its new normal of neglect and dysfunction. The stage was set, the players were in position, and Belle Haven, with its quiet streets and expensive homes, was about to become the scene of something it had never seen before. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Martha Elizabeth Moxley was born on August 16, 1960, in San Francisco, California. She was the daughter of Dorthy and David Moxley, and she had a brother named John. Though the family had roots in California, they were Midwesterners at heart. David came from Kansas, Dorthy from Michigan. They carried with them values shaped by the heartland: honesty, hard work, and an emphasis on doing right by others. They were, by all accounts, down-to-earth people, navigating an increasingly complex world. From the beginning, Martha was what her mother called a very easy child. She was popular and vivacious, possessing a self-confidence that allowed her to succeed at nearly everything she attempted. Creativity ran through her like a current. She played both violin and piano. She excelled at drawing and painting, and in the Moxley home, an entire room was dedicated to her art projects. One wall featured an elaborate collage she'd constructed from magazine clippings, a mosaic of images and ideas that reflected her inner world. Martha kept a diary where she would sit and write or draw pictures, processing her thoughts in private. She was a conscientious letter writer, maintaining contact with friends even after distance separated them. She had a constant companion in her cat, Tiger, who seemed to understand her moods without words. In the summer of 1974, the Moxley family relocated from Piedmont, California, to Greenwich, Connecticut. The move was significant, a shift from West Coast informality to the more rigid social structures of the East Coast elite. They settled into a large, stucco English-style mansion at 38 Walsh Lane in Belle Haven, one of the most exclusive neighborhoods in one of the wealthiest towns in America. The house sat on 3 acres and featured extensive formal gardens, though they had fallen into disrepair. The property was impressive, but it required work. Martha's room was on the 3rd floor, what her mother described as like a little garret. She had her own bathroom up there, a private space where she could retreat from the world below. From her window, she could see across the street and diagonally to another large home on Otter Rock Drive, the Skakel residence. That first year in Greenwich, Martha attended Western Junior High School. She was only 14, navigating the social landscape of a new community with the ease that seemed to define her. She made friends quickly, moving comfortably between the public school students and those from Belle Haven who attended private institutions. Her adaptability was remarkable. At school, Martha distinguished herself. She was considered a leader among her peers and was voted the girl with the best personality in her class. She worked on the yearbook. She practiced her music and continued her artwork. She tutored classmates in Spanish, having advanced a year ahead in the subject. Everything seemed to come naturally to her. In the spring of 1975, Rushton Skakel, the Moxleys' neighbor, sponsored the family for membership in the Belle Haven Club. It was a gesture of welcome, an acknowledgement that the Moxleys had arrived and were being accepted into the inner circle of Greenwich society. By the summer of 1975, Martha was blossoming into a beautiful young woman. She had lost what remained of her baby fat. She got her braces off. She was tanned and fit from hours spent swimming and playing tennis at the Belle Haven Club. She looked, as people noted, terrific. Boys were beginning to notice. Martha had a boyfriend that summer, Peter Zaluka. Her mother characterized it as puppy love, the kind of relationship that was sweet and uncomplicated, more about companionship than intensity. Martha was still dating Peter when everything changed. During the late summer of 1975, Martha became acquainted with two of the Skakel brothers who lived across the way. Thomas, known as Tommy, was 17. Michael was 15. Both boys were interested in Martha, drawn to her confidence and beauty. Michael, according to multiple sources, became infatuated with her. At some point, he may have been her boyfriend, or at least considered himself to be. The exact nature of their relationship remained unclear, filtered through the perceptions of teenagers and the imprecise language of dating in the mid-1970s. Martha documented these interactions in her diary, creating a record that would later become crucial. On October 4th, 1975, she attended a party and wrote afterward that Tom S. was being an ass. At the dance, he kept putting his arms around me and making moves. She was annoyed by his persistence, his assumption that she welcomed his attention. There were other entries about drives in Thomas's car, trips for ice cream with both brothers. She wrote about sitting practically on Tom's lap, about him constantly putting his hand on her knee. She noted that Thomas was trying to advance their physical relationship, attempting what teenagers called first base, second base. Martha seemed caught between being flattered by the attention and uncomfortable with the pressure. Her concerns about Michael were more pointed. On September 19, 1975, Michael's 15th birthday, she wrote that Michael was so totally out of it that he was being a real ass. He had told her she was leading Tom on, a criticism that stung. She made a resolution in her diary that day: I really have to stop going over there. But Belle Haven was a small neighborhood, and avoiding the Skakel brothers entirely would have been difficult. The houses were close, the social circles overlapped. The Belle Haven Club brought everyone together. In the week immediately before October 30th, Martha stayed out late at a party given by neighborhood friends, Holly and Tori Fuchs. She didn't come home until around 2 or 3 in the morning. She was 15 years old, testing boundaries, living the life of a teenager in an affluent suburb where the rules seemed more relaxed than elsewhere. She was still dating Peter Zaluka. She was still writing in her diary. She was still spending time at the Belle Haven Club, still tutoring classmates in Spanish, still creating art in her third-floor room. She was still, by all appearances, the same easy, confident girl who had moved to Greenwich just over a year earlier. October 30th, 1975, was Mischief Night, the evening before Halloween when teenagers across America engaged in harmless pranks, throwing eggs, toilet papering houses, reveling in minor acts of rebellion. Martha Moxley went out that evening wearing her blue down parka over a white flower print turtleneck and blue jeans. She was with friends, laughing, enjoying the freedom of a suburban autumn night. Martha, along with her friends Helen Eakes and Jeffrey Byrne, eventually made their way to the Skakel residence. They walked across the backyard through a hole in the fence and over to Otter Rock Drive. Rushton Skakel Sr. was out of town on a hunting trip, and the house was unsupervised. It was the kind of place where teenagers could gather without adult interference. Around 9:30 that evening, Martha was last seen falling together with 17-year-old Thomas Skakel behind the fence near the Skakel pool. What falling together meant, whether it was playful, romantic, or something else, would become a matter of intense scrutiny. At approximately the same time, somewhere between 9:30 and 10 o'clock, Dorthy Moxley was upstairs at 38 Walsh Lane, painting the mullions on the windows. Through the glass, she heard a loud commotion outside. The voices were distinct, male youths, or at least one male youth. What struck her was the tone. The voices did not sound friendly or innocent. Around the same time, several dogs in the Belle Haven neighborhood began barking loudly. The barking was sustained, persistent, as if the animals sensed something wrong. Curiously, the Skakel's German Shepherd, Max, was uncharacteristically quiet. Martha was expected home at a reasonable hour. The Moxleys didn't have a strict curfew, but Martha was responsible. She always came home. Except this time, she didn't. Dorothy fell asleep watching a movie. When she woke up sometime after midnight, around 1:30 or 2 in the morning, she checked Martha's third-floor bedroom. The bed was empty. Her daughter was still missing. David Moxley was out of town on a business trip, so it fell to Dorothy to initiate the search. She didn't go outside herself, but instead began making phone calls to Martha's friends, trying to piece together where her daughter might be. She called Helen Ix first. Helen told her that Martha had last been seen with Thomas Skakel at the Skakel house. Dorothy then called the Skakel residence repeatedly, speaking to Thomas's sister, Julie. Thomas wouldn't come to the phone himself at first. He told Julie to relay the information. He had last seen Martha at 9:30, at the back door, saying she was going in to study for a test. When Dorothy insisted on speaking directly to Thomas, he told her he had no idea where Martha was. Dorothy also called Martha's boyfriend, Peter Zaluka. His mother said Peter had been home the entire night. He was grounded. At Dorothy's request, her son John got in his car and drove around the Belle Haven neighborhood for half an hour, searching. He saw only one person, a drunk kid sleeping off the side of the road. No sign of Martha. Around 3:35 in the morning, John went out again, driving around Greenwich until dawn broke over the Connecticut suburbs. At 3:48 in the morning, Dorothy called the Greenwich Police Department and reported her daughter missing. Patrolman Daniel Merchant responded to the Moxley residence to interview Dorothy. She told him she didn't suspect Martha had run away. It wasn't like her to stay out this late. Merchant searched the Moxley residence and a small cottage in the rear, but found no clues. 2 Greenwich police cars conducted a motorized search of the Belle Haven area, officers using flashlights to peer into the shadows between the grand homes. By morning, the police still weren't greatly concerned. Worrying teenagers who stayed out late was common, particularly after a night of Halloween pranks. At 9:15, juvenile officer Dan Hickman called Dorothy and informed her that the Youth Division office was handling her daughter's case. Hickman and his partner, Millard Jones, conducted another motorized search of the area. Around 9:30 or 10 o'clock that morning, Dorothy decided to search on her own. She walked across Walsh Lane to the Skakel residence and knocked on the rear sun porch door. The Skakel's German Shepherd, Max, barked ferociously at her approach. Michael Skakel answered the door. He looked pale, disheveled, and hungover. Dorothy asked him if he knew where Martha was. Michael's answer was simple, no. Dorothy asked if Martha might have fallen asleep in the Skakel family camper, a Revcon that sat on the property. The family gardener, Franz Wittine, checked the camper again. There was no sign of Martha. Hours were passing. The sun was up, and Martha had been gone all night. At approximately 12:15 in the afternoon on October 31, 1975, 15-year-old Sheila McGuire was walking through a wooded section of the Moxley property. It was common for neighborhood children to use this area as a path, cutting between houses in the casual way teenagers do when they've lived somewhere long enough to know every shortcut. Sheila was on her way to the Moxley house to see if Martha wanted to go downtown. Walking across the yard, Sheila noticed something lying beneath a large pine tree about 200 feet from the house. At first, she thought it was a sleeping bag on top of a foam mattress. She stepped closer. Then she saw the partially clothed body of her friend. Sheila ran to the Moxley house and rang the doorbell. Jean Walker, who was visiting Dorothy Moxley, answered. Dorothy followed closely behind. Sheila was crying. "I found Martha," she said. Dorothy asked where. "Out under the tree," Sheila replied. When Dorothy asked if Martha was okay, Sheila sobbed, "I don't think so." Dorothy, stunned, started to go outside, but Jean Walker stopped her. "I'd better go look," Walker said. She took Sheila's hand and they walked down the sloping lawn toward the large pine tree. Sheila stopped and pointed toward the tree but would not go any closer. Gene Walker approached alone. Martha was lying face down beneath the low-hanging boughs, partially hidden by the evergreen branches. Her head was facing east. Her blue jeans and panties were pulled down below her knees. She was still wearing her blue down jacket, open over the flower print turtleneck. Her head was covered with dried blood, a bloody mess. Her eyes were closed. Walker knelt and touched the small of Martha's back. The body was ice cold. A sudden fear overcame Gene Walker, a sense that she was being watched. She dashed back to the house, taking Sheila with her. When they returned, Dorothy asked if Martha was okay. Walker paused before telling her that her daughter was dead. Dorothy collapsed into a chair, crying hysterically. Gene Walker quickly realized they needed to notify the police. The call was made minutes before juvenile officers Dan Hickman and Millard Jones, who had been conducting their motorized search of the area, arrived at the Moxley residence. At 12:30, Hickman and Jones received a radio transmission from police headquarters. Jones had been waiting in line at a hot dog stand when the call came through. They drove to the house with flashing lights and sirens blaring, parking in the driveway approximately 10 feet from the house. Sheila McGuire was outside, sobbing uncontrollably. "She's down there under that tree," she said, pointing. She would not approach the body. Jones and Hickman ran to the pine tree. Jones checked the partially clothed body and found no vital signs. Martha was obviously dead. When they first viewed the body, the shaft of the golf club was sticking through Martha's head, or embedded in her head and chest. Millard Jones was the first person to move Martha's body, rolling her over to check for a carotid pulse. Jones went to the Moxley house to notify headquarters by telephone, attempting to prevent the news of a homicide from transmitting over the police scanner, which was monitored by reporters and civilians. He instructed Hickman to stay with the body. When Jones returned, Hickman was frantically calling on the police radio for additional officers and the medical examiner rather than guarding the scene. Captain Tom Keegan, who arrived shortly after, later observed Hickman petting a dog, Max, the Skakel's German Shepherd, that was reportedly licking the trail of blood left in the grass and leaves. The dog was, as one investigator would later note, literally eating evidence. By 12:45, Captain Tom Keegan, chief of detectives, and detectives Steve Carroll and Joe McGlynn had arrived on the scene. Within minutes, Walsh Lane and Otter Rock Drive became crowded with uniformed officers, detectives, emergency personnel, journalists, curious neighbors, and other onlookers. Civilian onlookers approached the crime scene, getting as close as 20 feet from the body. They were trampling over the leaf trail and driveway where blood and other evidence had been found. The Greenwich Police Department was forced to use manila rope and traffic barricades to cordon off the scene. They didn't have specialized crime scene tape. Detectives Carroll and McGlynn observed Martha lying on her right side in a semi-fetal position. Carroll noted no defensive wounds on her body. Several pieces of a broken golf club were found on the lawn near the crime scene. Specifically, the head of a 6-iron Tony Penna golf club and 2 pieces of shaft measuring 8 and 11 inches were lying on the ground. That same day, they located a similar set of Tony Penna golf clubs at the Skakel residence, clubs that had belonged to Ann Skakel, the deceased mother. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Evidence suggested the initial brutal attack probably occurred in the driveway, where a small amount of blood was found. The fatal assault appeared to have commenced near where 2 large pools of blood were discovered. Martha had then been dragged through the leaves beneath the tree, where her body now lay. Inside the house, Dorothy was with friends, trying desperately to hold herself together while police questioned her. Captain Keegan interviewed her from 1:15 until 3 o'clock that afternoon. Dr. Richard Danehauer, the Moxley family doctor, arrived around 12:30 or 12:40. He confirmed Martha was dead and possibly moved the body slightly to place a stethoscope on her chest. Dr. Coleman Kelly, the local medical examiner, arrived at 1:15. The police already knew that Thomas Skakel was the last person reported seen with Martha Moxley. That first afternoon, detectives interviewed Julie and Michael Skakel. Michael, who was at home, appeared pale, disheveled, and hungover. He ran up to Julie and her friend, Andrea Shakespeare, when they arrived, telling them Martha had been killed and that he and Tommy were the last to see her that night. Detectives immediately began looking for suspects. They focused first on 26-year-old Ed Hammond, a Columbia graduate student who lived in the neighborhood. He was brought down to the police station for questioning around 3 o'clock. Dorthy Moxley would later recall that police just zeroed in on Ed Hammond. At 4 o'clock, the Greenwich Police Department requested assistance from the Connecticut State Police Mobile Crime Scene Lab. Chief Medical Examiner Elliot Gross informed Captain Keegan that he had a heavy caseload and could not respond. He instructed Keegan to bag the body and take it to the morgue. The mobile crime lab arrived between approximately 4:30 and 5 o'clock. Thomas Skakel was taken to Greenwich Police Headquarters for formal questioning at 5:40 that evening. He would return home at 10:30. Martha's body was removed from the crime scene at 5:30 by Charles Danks of the Riley Gallagher Funeral Home and taken to the Greenwich Hospital morgue for the autopsy, which would be conducted the following day. During the 5 hours the body lay at the scene, detectives basically ignored examining the surrounding area for clues. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, at least 12 people had touched or stood over the body. The overall impression of the immediate aftermath was one of severe disorganization. The Greenwich Police Department had little experience handling homicide cases, and it showed. Important evidence was lost, ignored, and bungled within the first few minutes of the investigation. The crime scene had been contaminated almost from the moment it was discovered. Whatever chance there had been to preserve crucial evidence had slipped away in those first chaotic hours, trampled underfoot by well-meaning officers, curious onlookers, and a dog licking blood from the grass. On the morning of November 1st, Dr. Elliot Gross, the Connecticut Chief Medical Examiner, arrived at the Greenwich Police Department at 10 o'clock. He viewed videotapes and photographs of the crime scene, then traveled to the scene itself to take his own photographs. The official autopsy began at Greenwich Hospital at 12:40 that afternoon and concluded at 6:45 that evening. Dr. Gross determined that Martha Moxley had been killed with a golf club. Details that leaked from the autopsy indicated the cause of death was multiple head wounds caused by that weapon. Martha had not been sexually molested. She was not under the influence of drugs or alcohol. Several people attended the autopsy, including Dr. Gross's assistant, Dr. Alfred Tangney, local pathologists, and various police officers and detectives, Dr. Coleman Kelly, youth officer Dan Hickman, and detectives Jim Lunny, Ted Brosco, Dan Pendergast, and Tom Sorensen. Officer Hickman, one of the first responders to the scene, quickly left the room after making statements about his observations. He became sick at the sight of blood. That same morning at 9:30, Captain Keegan directed Greenwich Police and Gas Company personnel to search the crime scene and surrounding area for the missing handle of the golf club. They used a metal detector. The search yielded nothing. The following day, November 2nd, Greenwich detectives removed a set of golf clubs matching the murder weapon from the Skakel home. Police began an intensive search of the crime scene and neighborhood for the missing piece, the grip and shaft, believed to be between 16 and 24 inches in length. At 5:55 that evening, Chief Stephen Barron issued a press release concerning the missing portion of the stainless steel golf club. Captain Keegan dispatched a nationwide teletype at 6 o'clock regarding the missing murder weapon component. On November 3rd, Thomas Skakel was taken to the Connecticut State Police facility in Bethany for a polygraph test at 7:15 in the evening. He was given 3 separate tests, but the results were inconclusive. He was too exhausted and anxious. He was returned home around 1 o'clock in the morning. That same day, Captain Keegan called the Marine Division and requested a search of the Belle Haven waterfront. The shoreline was searched on foot and by skiff. 2 attempts yielded nothing. Martha Moxley's funeral was held on November 4th at the First Lutheran Church in Greenwich. More than 500 people attended. All the pews in the nave and the balcony were filled. Rows of folding chairs had to be set up in the back, and many young people stood behind these chairs and spilled out the church door. Students from Greenwich High School were excused from classes to attend, as were students from local private schools. Reverend Richard Mannis read a eulogy written by a group of Martha's friends. It stated that Martha loved life, made more friends than most people do in a lifetime, and was always the first to come around, and she was fun to be around. Reverend Mannis emphasized that family came first in Martha's life. Martha's closed coffin was situated in front of a church window where the autumn sun shone through the stained glass. 9 of her closest friends approached the casket, and each placed a single yellow rose on it as a sign of affection. All of them broke into tears during this ritual. After the service, Martha's coffin was carried into the hearse. The funeral procession was led by a single Greenwich police car with its lights silently flashing. David and Dorthy Moxley, along with their son John, rode in the first of a long line of black limousines to Putnam Hills Cemetery. Several youths were seen crying as the coffin was carried away. Thomas Skakel attended the funeral. He stood apart from his friends and family. Witnesses had noted that on the afternoon Martha's body was found, Thomas had been seen joking with people and wearing a big red cowboy hat. Some felt he could not have behaved that way if he had just murdered someone. After the service, Dorthy Moxley came up and gave Thomas Skakel a hug. This gesture occurred despite the immediate suspicion cast upon Thomas and the Skakel family in the days following the murder. On November 9th, Thomas took a second polygraph test. This time he reportedly passed. The result created an immediate problem for detectives who increasingly suspected Thomas, given that he was the last person reported to have seen Martha alive. When Thomas passed the polygraph, police subsequently shifted their focus to other possible suspects. Yet they never released any documents concerning the examination and did not eliminate Thomas as a suspect. Even after passing, suspicion continued to swirl around him. Detectives needed to reconcile the past polygraph with their growing certainty about Thomas's involvement. They theorized that his medical and psychological history might prove he was capable of murder but had blocked out any memory of it. During interrogations, Thomas appeared to draw a blank when discussing attacking or injuring Martha. Greenwich detectives conjectured that perhaps he passed the polygraph because he didn't remember killing her, a theory required to support the idea that Thomas was subject to violent fits and blackouts. On November 10th, Detective Lunny initiated an extensive background check on Ken Littleton, the Skakel family tutor. 4 days later, on November 14th, Rushton Skakel brought Thomas, Michael, Julie, John, and Jimmy Terrian to the police station to give statements. Michael Skakel told police that on the night of the murder, he had gone to his cousin Jimmy Terrian's house to watch Monty Python's Flying Circus, stayed until between 10:30 and 11, and then returned home and went straight to bed. The following day, detectives Brosco and Lunny re-interviewed several witnesses, including Skakel family members Andrea Shakespeare, Jim Terrian, and Helen Eakes. On November 21st, Ed Hammond, a primary suspect who lived next door, took a second polygraph test and passed. Despite this result, Hammond remained a prime suspect for several months. 3 days later, on November 24th, Greenwich Police Chief Stephen Barron contacted the Neighborhood Cleaners Association in New York City and requested that members report any blood-stained clothing brought in since the murder. December brought intensified activity. On the 2nd, police contacted 55 cleaners in the lower Fairfield County area, asking them to report any blood-stained clothing. That same day, John Moxley was given a polygraph test and passed. On December 6th, Detective Jim Lunny questioned Rushton Skakel about whether any family members or household staff had ever been confined to a mental institution or similar facility. Mr. Skakel denied this. 3 days later, on December 9th, John Skakel took a polygraph examination and passed. On December 11th, during re-interviews with detectives, Helen Eakes and Jeffrey Byrne revealed new information. They had observed Martha and Thomas engaging in flirtatious horseplay, pushing and shoving, near the back door of the Skakel residence around 9:30 on the night of the murder. This suggested a possible motive, sexual advances being spurned, leading to Thomas becoming enraged. That same day, Detective Lunny searched the Skakel family's ski lodge in Windham, New York, having received Rushton Skakel's permission. The search yielded nothing. The following day, December 12th, Greenwich police formally received the autopsy report from Dr. Elliot Gross. On December 13th, Detectives Carroll and Lunny re-interviewed Thomas Skakel at length and obtained hair samples from him. 4 days later, on December 17th, Dorthy Moxley took a polygraph test at the state crime lab in Bethany. The polygraph examiner concluded that she was too nervous and upset for the results to be conclusive. A videotape was recorded by the Connecticut State Crime Lab and viewed by Greenwich detectives. The investigation was in full swing, but it was becoming increasingly clear that the case would not be resolved quickly. Thomas Skakel remained the primary focus despite having passed a polygraph. The missing section of the golf club had not been found. The crime scene had been compromised from the start, and with each passing day, memories faded and evidence grew colder. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In mid-January 1976, Greenwich police received written authorization from Rushton Skakel Sr. to obtain Thomas's school, medical, and psychological records. Detectives Steve Carroll and Jim Lunny used this permission to interview Dr. Walter Camp, the Skakel family pediatrician. Dr. Camp told detectives about Thomas's epilepsy of the stomach and provided records showing Thomas was often uncontrollable and had to be physically restrained. A neurologist, Dr. Anderson, who had operated on Thomas for a linear fracture of the skull sustained when he jumped out of a moving car, would not cooperate and provided nothing to the detectives. Within days, the cooperation evaporated. Greenwich detectives were contacted by Chris Roosevelt, a former Justice Department lawyer and board member for the Whitby School where Thomas had attended. Roosevelt advised the detectives that he would personally contact Rushton and Thomas Skakel to obtain oral permission for the records. During this conversation, Roosevelt became highly agitated. He implied that Thomas was about to be arrested and warned that if Thomas were arrested, he would be defended by a battery of lawyers who would claim the boy was temporarily insane. This intervention effectively shut down the investigative path focused on Thomas's records. 2 days later, Rushton Skakel formally withdrew his authorization to release Thomas's school and medical records. Minutes after making this decision, Rushton collapsed, complaining of chest pains, and was checked into Greenwich Hospital. While at the hospital, Rushton informed detectives Carroll and Lunny that he had retained Manny Margolis as Thomas's criminal attorney. The walls were going up. By the end of January, attorney Manny Margolis had advised Captain Keegan that he had instructed the Skakel family not to speak with the police. With local avenues closed off, Greenwich police sought assistance from major city departments. In early February, detectives Carroll and Lunny traveled to Detroit, Michigan, to consult with members of the Detroit Police Department Homicide Squad on the case and receive advice. They attempted to secure a written statement from Ken Littleton, the Skakel family tutor at Brunswick School, but he was unavailable. Later that month, detectives met with Thomas Skakel's family advisors, Father Thomas Guinan and Father Mark Connolly, regarding the medical and psychiatric tests the police wanted Thomas to undergo. A follow-up meeting with Rushton Skakel, Father Connolly, and attorney Manny Margolis ended with Rushton stating he would make a decision after consulting with Margolis. March brought further resistance. Margolis informed Greenwich police that Thomas Skakel would not comply with their request for medical and psychiatric testing. Ed Hammond and his mother were re-interviewed, though Hammond was now treated as a witness rather than a suspect. Mid-month, Thomas Skakel underwent a series of psychological tests at Presbyterian Hospital in New York City, arranged by Dr. Stanley Less and administered by Dr. Patrick de Gramont. Thomas used the pseudonym Thomas Butler. Greenwich detectives consulted with the Nassau County Police Department homicide investigators, who reported that the Greenwich investigation was conducted competently and professionally. But the public frustration was mounting. Near the end of March, Fairfield County State's Attorney Donald Brown publicly stated that the police were apparently being frustrated by the refusal of a particular family which could supply pertinent information. Although he refused to name the family, everyone in Greenwich knew he was referring to the Skakels. Days later, late on a March afternoon, Rushton Skakel visited the Moxley residence holding a drink. He claimed to have just returned from an AA meeting. Rushton told David and Dorthy Moxley that Thomas had undergone unspecified examinations that purportedly proved negative. David Moxley urged Rushton to provide the test results to the Greenwich police, but Rushton refused, citing advice from his lawyer. By month's end, Detroit homicide investigators Commander Gerald Hale and Inspector John Locke had arrived in Greenwich to offer advice and assistance. During this period, Thomas Skakel was absent from school. Neighborhood rumors claimed he had been shipped to Switzerland. In reality, Thomas had gone to Ireland for several weeks to visit his aunt, Pat Cuff. The family claimed the trip was long planned, though it coincided with Thomas being a murder suspect. April brought a series of revealing interviews and confrontations. During an interview with Detroit investigators, Mildred Eakes told them that Rushton Skakel had claimed the psychiatric tests showed Thomas was not involved in the murder. Mildred also relayed that Chris Roosevelt had advised Rushton not to release Thomas's Whitby file because it contained a doctor's report stating the boy was subject to blackouts. Mildred Eakes suggested that Ken Littleton should be investigated. Greenwich police attempted to re-interview Ken Littleton at Brunswick School, but he refused to speak to them without first consulting his attorney, Manny Margolis. Days later, Littleton refused again to speak to Greenwich police and would not sign a statement that would support circumstantial evidence against Thomas Skakel, asserting his belief that Thomas was innocent. Attorney John Meerbergen soon informed the Greenwich police that he had been retained by Ken Littleton. Mid-month, Detective Jim Lunny and a Detroit homicide investigator encountered Thomas Skakel celebrating his 18th birthday at Boodle's, a local bar. Lunny spoke to Thomas directly, stating, "I may be on this case for 100 years, but I'm going to prove you did it or you didn't do it." Police interviewed a witness regarding the barking of the Ix and Bjork dogs on the night of the murder, with the witness suggesting the Ix dog may have witnessed part or all of the crime. Captain Keegan and Detective Lunny checked with the Animal Control Division for any prior complaints concerning the Skakel dog, Max, but found nothing on file. Ken Littleton was re-interviewed by Greenwich police with his attorney present, but he again declined to sign any statement incriminating Thomas. Late in the month, Thomas Skakel was admitted to Greenwich Hospital for hemorrhagic gastritis, a condition frequently associated with drug or alcohol abuse. By May, Dr. Stanley Lessy submitted a full report on Thomas Skakel's medical and psychological tests to the Skakel family and their attorneys. The investigation languished throughout the summer and into the fall due to the Skakel family's lack of cooperation. The Moxleys hired their own attorney, Jacob Zeldes, who, after discussions with Captain Keegan and Detective Lunny, arranged to obtain the services of a doctor who would confer with the doctor who had examined Thomas Skakel. This meeting was agreed upon, and Zeldes had been in contact with the Skakels and their attorneys. That same year, the Connecticut legislature amended the statute of limitations to explicitly state that there is no statute of limitations for Class A felonies and capital felonies. This was considered a clarifying act, confirming that murder was exempt from any limitation period. In mid-October, the Greenwich police experienced what they initially thought was a major break. Ken Littleton failed a polygraph examination. He explained to investigators that he failed the test because he was upset over his recent criminal activity and arrest. Littleton admitted that he had been arrested that summer in Nantucket for grand larceny, breaking and entering, and burglary. He was accused of breaking into stores and a boat on 4 separate occasions and stealing approximately $4,000 worth of items. Littleton's arrest and failed polygraph test convinced Greenwich police that they had finally found their man. They virtually forgot about Thomas Skakel and focused almost entirely on Ken Littleton, looking deeper into his life and concluding he was a promising Williams graduate who had become a petty thief with apparent emotional problems. Within days, Littleton informed police that his attorney had advised him not to submit to any further testing. Detective Lunny met with attorney Manny Margolis to discuss obtaining interviews with members of the Skakel family concerning Ken Littleton. Margolis was provided a list of questions which he promised to try to get answered by the Skakels. At the end of October, on the first anniversary of the murder, detectives Carroll and Lunny conducted overnight surveillance at the crime scene. In early November, Manny Margolis informed Detective Lunny that he had conducted an interview with Thomas Skakel on the subject of Ken Littleton. Margolis provided the police with a list of answers regarding Littleton. Days later, detectives Carroll and Lunny began an extensive background investigation on Ken Littleton. The focus of the investigation had shifted entirely. Thomas Skakel, once the prime suspect, had been shielded by lawyers, withdrawn authorizations, and strategic resistance. Ken Littleton, the tutor who had arrived at the Skakel house on the very day of the murder, had become the new target. The investigation had stalled for nearly a year, and now it was pivoting toward a different theory entirely. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In the spring of 1977, the Moxley family's attorney, Jacob Zeldes, informed detectives Steve Carroll and Jim Lunny that he had hired a psychiatrist, Dr. Robert Davies of Yale New Haven Medical Center. The purpose was to meet with Dr. Stanley Lessa and evaluate the material concerning the psychological tests performed on Thomas Skakel. This evaluation focused on material that attorney Manny Margolis had made available. That May, Ken Littleton was given a 5 to 7 year suspended sentence for burglary charges in Nantucket, Massachusetts. At the time of his sentencing, Littleton refused to submit to a sodium amytal interview, often referred to as truth serum, regarding the Moxley case, even though it was offered in return for reduced charges. Late that year, the investigation focused heavily on information gathering. Captain Tom Keegan and Detective Jim Lunny traveled to Vermont to gather background information on Thomas Skakel, who was attending school there. 2 days later, they traveled to Boston to meet with Ken Littleton's probation officer to conduct further background investigation. The investigation's focus on Michael Skakel remained minimal during this period, as police did not consider him a suspect. However, an incident from 1977 would later become significant. Rushton Skakel Sr. asked Larry Ziccarelli, a family gardener and driver, to drive Michael into New York City for an appointment. Michael was distraught because he and his father had been fighting. On the way to the city, Michael told Ziccarelli that he had done something very bad and felt he had to either kill himself or get out of the country. While driving home, they were stopped in traffic on the Triborough Bridge. Michael jumped out of the car and ran to the side of the bridge. Ziccarelli managed to grab Michael and force him back into the car. Michael then leapt out of the other side and again tried to make it to the side of the bridge. After securing Michael the second time, Michael told Ziccarelli that if he knew what Michael had done, Ziccarelli would never talk to him again. In early March 1978, Michael Skakel was arrested in Windham, New York. He was driving the family Jeep on a local road near the scene of an accident. When a responding police officer signaled him to stop, Michael instead nearly ran the officer down. He fled the scene, and during the ensuing chase, Michael ran the Jeep into a telephone pole. The car was wrecked, but both Michael and his passenger were unharmed. Michael was arrested and charged with driving without a license, speeding, failure to comply, and driving while intoxicated. This was not the first time he had been in trouble in Windham. Following his arrest, Michael pled guilty to all charges except the DWI. The DWI case was held in abeyance. Later that afternoon, Michael was handcuffed and transported by 2 attendants and a doctor to Elon, a private treatment center and school for troubled youths in Maine. Tom Sheridan, a family advisor, worked out a deal wherein the case was dismissed on the condition that Michael attended Elon for at least 6 months. A memo written by Sheridan at the time indicated that Michael was under the influence of heavy drinking or smoking pot, or a combination of both, during the incident. When interviewed about nearly killing his companion and facing potential conviction for drunk driving, Michael's only comment was, "Next time I won't get caught." According to family sources, Michael was plagued with serious emotional problems and living a reckless and drug-fueled existence in 1978. The cost of attending Elon was $30,000 a year. When Michael first arrived at Elon, he was immediately taken to a trailer for a 3-hour taped interview. During this interview, Michael was repeatedly asked why he thought he was there. He said something happened, but wouldn't be specific. When the interviewer pressed Michael for details, he would laugh. At several points, Michael described a girl with a golf club embedded in her chest. Whenever he brought this up, he would laugh, leading the interviewer to ask, "Here we have a young lady who has a golf club embedded in her chest, and you're laughing. What's so funny about that?" The interviewer was convinced Michael knew something, but could not get him to admit anything. In early June, family advisor Tom Sheridan wrote a memo speculating that Michael could have killed Martha and doesn't know it, and possibly somebody else, i.e. Tommy, could have hidden the body. This suggested internal belief among the Skakel advisors that Michael was capable of the murder. Later that month, Thomas Skakel was expelled from Elmira College for academic reasons. October brought renewed attention to the case. Connecticut Governor Ella Grasso authorized a $20,000 reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of Martha Moxley's murderer. Days later, Greenwich police met with a psychic who claimed to have been having a dream about the Moxley homicide for 3 years. Detective Lunny conducted overnight surveillance at the crime scene on the 3rd anniversary of the murder. In mid-November, Michael Skakel escaped from the Elon school. He traveled to Boston and then on to New York before being returned to Elon by his brother, Rushton Jr., after a few days. 2 weeks later, Michael escaped from Elon again. Following this second escape, he remained at large for nearly 3 weeks. He was returned to the facility in mid-December by his brother. The following year brought little progress. Detective Lunny conducted surveillance at the crime scene on the 4th anniversary of Martha Moxley's murder in October 1979. The ritual was repeated in October 1980, marking the 5th anniversary. Around that time, Dorthy Moxley requested that the Greenwich police return Martha's diary and other personal effects that she had surrendered early in the investigation. In 1981, Rushton Skakel Sr. told his close friend and confidant, Mildred Eakes, that Michael had said he might have done it, referring to the murder. The Greenwich police, increasingly desperate, turned to psychics for potential leads. In late July, they contacted a second psychic about the case. Dorthy Moxley had met this woman in Hot Springs, Arkansas. In late September, Psychic Sue came to Greenwich, where Detective Lunny conducted a tour of the crime scene and surrounding areas for her. Detective Lunny conducted overnight surveillance at the crime scene again that October, marking the 6th anniversary of Martha Moxley's murder. The investigation had stalled. Years were passing. Thomas Skakel remained the primary suspect in the minds of detectives, though they had never been able to build a case strong enough for prosecution. Ken Littleton had been investigated extensively but never charged, and Michael Skakel, despite his troubling statements and behavior, was not considered a serious suspect by police during this period. Behind the scenes, however, people close to the Skakel family were beginning to wonder about Michael. The statements he made to Larry Ziccarelli on the Triborough Bridge, his bizarre laughter at Elon when describing a girl with a golf club embedded in her chest, Tom Sheridan's memo speculating about Michael's involvement, Rushton's confession to Mildred Eakes that Michael had said he might have done it. These were pieces of a puzzle that law enforcement had not yet assembled, clues scattered across years and buried in private conversations that would remain hidden for decades. By 1982, the investigation into Martha Moxley's murder had been largely put to rest. Ken Littleton was no longer considered a viable suspect, and the police could not investigate Thomas Skakel further due to the Skakel family's lack of cooperation. State's Attorney Donald Brown maintained that there was not enough evidence to pursue a grand jury. That summer, a major conflict emerged when local media attempted to access the police files on the cold case. In mid-July, Len Levitt, a reporter, and Ken Brief, the editor of the Greenwich Time and the Stamford Advocate, requested that all police records on the Moxley investigation be made public. Chief of Police Tom Keegan denied the request a week later. Levitt and Brief formally requested the documents be made public under the provisions of the State Freedom of Information Act in early August. That October, Chief Keegan requested permission to review and edit Len Levitt's subsequent article prior to publication, but his request was denied. Detective Jim Lunny conducted surveillance at the crime scene on the 7th anniversary of the murder. In early December, a hearing was held by the Connecticut Freedom of Information Commission regarding the Moxley police report. During this hearing, State's Attorney Donald Brown admitted that a confession by the murderer was the most likely way the case would be closed. Detroit Commander Gerald Hale, who had consulted on the case in 1976, told Len Levitt that whoever killed Martha Moxley should not have been able to get away with it. Hale felt strongly that the Skakel house should have been formally searched, believing that when it came to the Skakels, the Greenwich police were treading lightly. In early January 1983, Detective Lunny contacted Ken Littleton by telephone. Littleton, who was living in Canada at the time, disclosed that he had been talking to reporter Len Levitt to give his side of the story. Littleton stated that he was willing to undergo tests to prove his innocence, but he expressed that he did not trust the Greenwich police or the Connecticut State's Attorney. That May, the Freedom of Information Committee decided that Chief Keegan had to conduct an examination of the Moxley file, determine which documents could be disclosed, and then make those documents public. By summer, Len Levitt had completed the article he had been working on, but Ken Brief, the editor of the Greenwich Time and the Stamford Advocate, refused to publish it. The article sat on the shelf. The investigation remained stuck for the next several years, with virtually nothing happening on the case. Levitt later went on to head the investigative team at the New York Post and became a columnist specializing on the NYPD for Newsday, while the Moxley case remained stagnant. Starting in 1978 and continuing for at least the next 10 years, Michael Skakel was shuttled among numerous institutions for emotional and substance abuse problems. In 1986, David Moxley retired from Touche Ross. He and Dorthy moved from Greenwich to a waterfront condominium in Annapolis, Maryland, and bought a boat. The following year, Michael Skakel was in a rehab facility in Aberdeen, Maryland, Father Martin's, for drug and alcohol treatment. During his time there, Michael met an informant who would later be referred to as Batman in court documents, and the two became good friends. Michael told the informant that his father had sent him away in the mid-1970s because of something that happened. He stated that he had ended up in abusive treatment facilities for as long as 2 years in places like Maine and other locations. Michael said his family would kill him if he gave out certain information. He mentioned that he had been in a whole lot of facilities and his family kept moving him to prevent the police from tracking him down. Michael told the informant he really hated his dad for what he did to him and that the anger came out in violence. During a volleyball game at the facility, Michael spiked the ball and injured another patient. Instead of apologizing, he reportedly said, "I haven't felt that good since I killed cats with a golf club." Michael was reportedly one of the only patients who didn't have family members visit him during Family Week. In 1988, David Moxley died of a heart attack. He had been busy working for Bob Dole's presidential campaign and then got a job as a business manager for two recently merged law firms in New York. He was described as busy and loving his new job. Dorthy had taken David to Union Station so he could take a train to New York. When she hadn't heard from him for a couple of days, she traveled to the New York apartment and found him dead in bed, with his foot sticking out. David Moxley had been the one in charge of Martha's case, working with the police and overseeing everything. With David gone, Dorthy realized she would have to take responsibility for her daughter's case. She felt like someone had presented her with a polar bear and asked, "Now what do I do with a polar bear?" David Moxley was buried next to Martha in Putnam Hills Cemetery. The following spring, Thomas Skakel married Ann Maitland Gilman, a native of Boxford, Massachusetts, who worked for a retail clothing firm. Thomas, who lived under suspicion, had attended several different schools and traveled around the world. The couple settled in Pound Ridge, New York. Thomas worked for Harco International, a trade corporation with major political and financial connections, founded by Harvey Hammert and connected to both the Soviet government and American business interests. Life moved forward for everyone involved. The investigation remained frozen. The Moxley case had become one of those unsolved murders that communities whisper about but never resolve, a wound that never heals, a question that never gets answered. For Dorthy Moxley, now alone in Annapolis, the burden of seeking justice for her daughter had become hers to carry. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In 1990, Dorthy and John Moxley, together with John McCrate, David Moxley's former consultant colleague, launched an ambitious 10-week plan to reinvigorate Martha's case. They offered to hire experienced investigators to review the evidence and offered to pay for the computer hardware and personnel needed to automate the investigation for the Greenwich police. McCrate, at his own expense, had typed all the information from the redacted police reports into a computer to demonstrate how advanced technology could be used as an investigative tool. The police rejected all the Moxleys' offers. John Moxley said the rejection went over like a lead balloon and noted they were very territorial. The following year, external factors forced the case open. In May, William Kennedy Smith, a Kennedy cousin, was charged with rape in Palm Beach, Florida. The high-profile publicity surrounding this trial created momentum for reopening the Moxley case. A rumor surfaced that William Kennedy Smith had been present at the Skakel house on the night of Martha Moxley's death. Although this rumor proved to be unfounded, it directly resulted in a new investigation of the then cold case. Connecticut authorities reopened the investigation. In early June, reporter Len Levitt's article ran in the Greenwich Time under the headline, "Moxley Murder Case Still Haunts Greenwich." In early August, the Moxley family announced the reinvestment of the case. They increased the existing $20,000 reward to $50,000 and established and funded a toll-free tip line to assist the announced reinvestigation by the state attorney's office, headed by Frank Garr and Jack Solomon. The Skakel family and their attorneys hired Sutton Associates, a private detective agency, to conduct their own investigation into the murder. This was done presumably because the murder was back in the spotlight. When Michael Skakel, who had been shuttled among numerous institutions for years, met his former best friend Andrew Pugh again that year, Michael wanted to renew their friendship. Pugh told Michael he had misgivings about the murder. Michael told Pugh he did not kill Martha, but that he had been in the tree masturbating the night she was killed. Michael told Pugh that he was referring to the tree under which Martha's body was found. In 1991 or 1992, Michael Skakel told Sutton investigator Willis Krebs that he lied to Greenwich police in 1975 about going straight to bed after returning from the Terrians' house around 11:20 or 11:30. Instead, he had gone back out and was near or at the murder scene between 11:40 and 12:30 in the morning. The state's attorney's office prepared summary profile reports in about 1992 regarding the suspects Thomas Skakel and Kenneth Littleton. These reports summarized why each person was considered a suspect. The investigation by Sutton Associates resulted in a report that was later leaked to the media. This report disclosed that during interviews conducted by Sutton investigators, and often attended by Skakel family lawyers, both Thomas and Michael significantly changed their original 1975 alibis for the night of the murder. Thomas originally claimed he was doing homework inside the house at 9:30. In his statement to Sutton, Thomas changed his story, claiming that he and Martha kissed and fondled each other in the backyard of the Skakel property for about 20 minutes, from 9:30 until 9:50, culminating in mutual masturbation to orgasm. This encounter placed Thomas with Martha right around the time police assumed she was murdered. Michael still maintained he went to the Terrian home at 9:30, but he changed his return time, stating that once he returned home around 11:30, he went out again to peep in windows. Later details indicated he left his house at approximately 11:40 and began peeping in the neighborhood. Thomas Skakel's lawyers publicly suggested that Michael was guilty and that Michael's masturbation tale might be an attempt to explain the presence of his semen at the crime scene, given the advent of DNA technology. The following year brought even more public attention. Dominic Dunn, a popular author and celebrated journalist whose own daughter had been murdered, published his novel A Season in Purgatory. The fictional story closely resembled the Moxley case. Dunn's book and a subsequent television movie based on it stirred even more interest in the case. Dunn, after meeting Dorthy Moxley, conducted his own investigation, talking to many principals in the case and people who had never previously come forward. Rushton Skakel Sr. sold the house on Otter Rock Drive in 1993 for $3 million. He subsequently moved to an exclusive condominium development in Hobe Sound, Florida. That October, Dr. Henry Lee submitted his findings to the Greenwich Police Department in a 6-inch thick report. The revelations of the changed alibis, confirmed by the leaked Sutton Associates report, placed both Thomas and Michael Skakel closer to the time and location of Martha's murder, substantially altering the direction of the reinvestigation. In early January 1994, at a press conference, Jack Solomon, who was involved in the announced reinvestigation by the state attorney's office, admitted that the reinvestigation had turned up nothing substantial right now that would lead to any arrest. He blamed the Skakel family for not cooperating. Later that month, Dr. Henry Lee, who had submitted his comprehensive report the previous October, stated that his forensic science laboratory had done everything we could do with the available evidence. In mid-June, Martha's brother John Moxley flew to Boston and met with former suspect Ken Littleton and Littleton's lawyer in the lawyer's office. Littleton had been one of the prime suspects, had failed a polygraph test, and had behaved strangely since the incident. Littleton initially refused to use recording devices or contemporaneous notes, and John Moxley had to agree to answer any questions Littleton asked. John Moxley described Littleton's appearance and demeanor as confirming everything he had heard about him, noting that Littleton was a very, very strange guy who appeared paranoid. Littleton was quoted as saying he didn't know who killed Martha. Littleton told Moxley that he was very upset about the turns his life had taken and believed there was a conspiracy against him involving a big part of it was the Skakels. A big part of it was the police, the media. When John left, Littleton was described as the happiest guy in the world, shaking John's hand and saying, "Thanks for coming up." John Moxley felt he had been in the presence of a true wacko. The Sutton Associates files indicated that Littleton had a genetic and socio-cultural predisposition to bipolar mood disorder stemming from stressful occurrences and was a serious alcoholic, recovering in a 12-step program in the mid-1990s. At the end of September, Frank Garr retired from the Greenwich Police Department to work as an inspector for State Attorney Donald Brown's office. He was assigned full-time on the Moxley case. In early October, Sutton Associates interviewed Thomas Skakel. Thomas was running a bed and breakfast in Stockbridge, Massachusetts, where he lived with his wife and 2 children. During the interview, Thomas broke down sobbing and confessed he had lied to the police in 1975. Thomas stated that he did not leave Martha Moxley at 9:30 to go inside to study. Instead, he claimed he spent an additional 20 minutes or so with her behind his house. Thomas further claimed he did not change clothes or shower after the encounter, even though he soiled his clothing when Martha brought him to orgasm. He also gave conflicting reasons for not going to the Terriens' house that night. In October 1994, he said he was tired, while in February 1995, he said he didn't remember why he decided not to go. The changed alibis were explosive. Both brothers had placed themselves closer to Martha at critical times. Thomas's new story put him with Martha right around the time she was killed. Michael's new story had him wandering the neighborhood as a peeping Tom during the window when the murder occurred. The investigation, dormant for so long, was suddenly alive with new possibilities and new questions about what the Skakel brothers had really been doing the night Martha Moxley died. In early February 1995, during Thomas Skakel's 3rd interview with Sutton Associates, he changed his story again. This time, he claimed he was surprised to see Martha waiting inside his house after he returned from giving Andrea Shakespeare the car keys. When asked why she was waiting, he replied, "Maybe she wanted more of Tommy." He also contradicted his earlier account, saying there was initial friction between them, and he had asked Martha if she wanted to make love, and she had said no. Sutton investigators noted that Thomas's responses regarding these discrepancies were typically limited to "I don't know," or he would not reply at all. By October, Frank Garr admitted, "Nothing in the way of investigation has been done, probably in the last year." That November, documents and interviews collected by Sutton Associates, which had been assembled into draft chapters intended for a report to the Skakel family, were leaked by a freelance employee of Sutton to author Dominic Dunn. The family had rejected the pending report. Dunn secretly gave a copy of the files to Frank Garr. These became known as the Sutton Files. On November 26, Len Levitt published an article in Newsday magazine which described how Thomas Skakel changed his story and admitted he had lied to the police about his actions the night of the murder. Days later, on December 4th, Levitt published another article in Newsday magazine detailing how Michael Skakel changed his story and admitted he had lied to the police about his actions the night of the murder. Michael's new admission was that he lied about going straight to bed after returning from the Terriens' house around 11:20. Instead, he went back out and was near or at the crime scene between 11:40 and 12:30 in the morning. Michael admitted to Sutton investigators that he went to the Moxley house, climbed a tree and threw pebbles at a window he thought was Martha's. He climbed down and went into the side yard where the attack occurred. By 1994, DNA fingerprinting was state-of-the-art. The revelations that Thomas expanded his time with Martha to 9:50, and that Michael admitted to being on the crime scene after the murder supposedly occurred, meant that Michael emerged as a suspect for the first time since the investigation began. Frank Garr contacted Steve Carroll and told him he now considered Michael a possible suspect. Garr's prime reason for suspecting Michael was the fact that he had changed his story. However, the authorities still held on to their belief that the murder occurred between 9:35 and 10, which hindered a full investigation of Michael's late-night actions. Early in November, Dorthy and John Moxley hosted a dinner at the Belle Haven Club to thank those who worked and supported them in the investigation. The dinner was attended by 39 law enforcement officials, lawyers, and journalists, including Steve Carroll, Jim Lunny, Jack Solomon, Frank Garr, Donald Brown, Ken Maudie, and Henry Lee, along with family friends. Dorthy told the crowd, "You are such wonderful people to be out there working for justice." In February 1996, a man named Lou Phillips telephoned the Unsolved Mysteries tip line and claimed he had lived in the same house with Michael Skakel at Elon for 2 years in the late 70s while undergoing drug and alcohol treatment. Phillips claimed that Michael had admitted to several people that he killed Martha Moxley with a golf club. According to Phillips, Michael confessed in a group therapy session, saying he had killed her because he was drunk. The transcript of this tip was passed along to Frank Garr. That same month, Michael Skakel visited Cuba with his cousin Bobby Kennedy Jr. and a delegation from Citizens Energy. Michael suggested that Fidel Castro turn an abandoned nuclear reactor into the Atomic Hotel and Nightclub, a suggestion Castro found humorous and called a good idea. During this time, Michael Skakel befriended Michael Kennedy's babysitter, a teenager with whom Kennedy was having an affair. Skakel tried to discourage the affair and acted as a messenger among the girl's father, Kennedy, and Victoria Gifford Kennedy after the babysitter's mother discovered the affair and reportedly attempted suicide. In mid-June, Dorthy and John Moxley doubled the reward for information leading to the arrest and conviction of the murderer from $50,000 to $100,000 for 1 year. That October, State's Attorney Don Brown stated that trace evidence had been sent away for DNA analysis, with results expected in early 1997. Brown said he would base his decision on whether to call a grand jury on the results of these tests. Frank Garr took evidence to Washington, D.C. to the Defense Department to perform advanced DNA tests. Elaine Pagliaro, an assistant to Dr. Henry Lee, confirmed to the press that DNA tests were not performed on the Moxley evidence by Lee's lab. Only blood type and comparison tests on hair were conducted. In January 1997, Lee stated that the Defense Department tests would be performed on minute amounts of evidence found on Martha's clothing. That August, Peter Robbins was promoted to chief of the Greenwich Police Department. Robbins took charge after the previous chief, Kenneth Maudie, left following separate investigations that revealed improprieties in the department, including Maudie allegedly doing favors for a local millionaire in return for a free trip to London. Robbins, a 27-year veteran whose father had also been chief, promised to clean up the department. He planned to hire Vernon Gibberth, author of Practical Homicide Investigation, to train Greenwich detectives on criminal investigations, particularly homicides. That same month, Frank Garr told the press that an important piece of evidence was undergoing testing. He said that results, expected in 1998, might allow for prosecution. Garr personally transported the evidence to the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology in Washington, which utilized a new method of genetic testing capable of identifying minute amounts of genetic material years after death. In September, State's Attorney Donald Brown officially retired but had maintained control of the Moxley case as a special prosecutor. Brown suddenly gave up the Moxley case shortly before a book about the murder was published. That October, Mark Foreman, a former Los Angeles detective turned author, began investigating the case. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. Early in the month, Foreman and retired detective Steve Carroll visited the former Moxley property. The current residents refused permission to take pictures, with the mother stating, "It's too bad that this girl was murdered." Foreman was later called by Greenwich police regarding alleged trespassing. On October 11th, Foreman spoke with youth officer Millard Jones, one of the first officers who found the body in 1975. Jones revealed the shocking detail that the shaft of the golf club was sticking through Martha's head. Jones's partner, Dan Hickman, later corroborated this, saying he saw a shiny object impaled through the skull and coming out the other side. On October 23rd, the Greenwich Time ran a story by Joe Johnson detailing the interviews with Jones and Hickman, publicly corroborating the claim that the murder weapon was embedded in Martha's head at the crime scene. Tom Keegan, who was running for re-election, denied this, stating the missing piece was not present at the scene or in the body. The following day, State Attorney Jonathan Benedict stated that a decision would be made early in 1998 as to whether anyone would be arrested for the murder. During his research, Furman spoke to Chief Robins Frank Garr, Jack Solomon, and Donald Brown, nearly all of whom refused to cooperate or share information, citing a desire not to jeopardize the prosecution of the open case. In December, Tom Sheridan, Michael Skakel's attorney for the Wyndham incident and who represented him concerning the Moxley murder, stated he no longer represented Michael Skakel and did not know who had taken over the case. On New Year's Eve, Michael Skakel's cousin, Michael Kennedy, died in a skiing accident on the slopes of Aspen Mountain. Kennedy ran headlong into a tree and died of massive head and spinal injuries while playing an improvised game of football on the slopes. Rushton Skakel Sr., who had sold the Otter Rock Drive house in 1993, was living in Hobe Sound, Florida. He was 74 years old and suffering from serious health problems. In June 1998, State's Attorney Jonathan Benedict initiated a rarely used investigatory grand jury process. Superior Court Judge George Thim began an 18-month, one-man grand jury review of information gathered by Frank Garr and the State Attorney's Office. The grand jury was convened 1 month after the publication of the book Murder in Greenwich by Mark Foreman. The target of the grand jury probe was Michael Skakel. State's attorneys, for the first time in this case, had the power to subpoena witnesses. Judge Thim was expected to investigate not only the criminal case against Michael Skakel, but also explore issues that might be brought up in a criminal trial and determine whether any crimes were committed by the police or state's attorney office. Frank Garr had told the press in August 1997 that results from advanced DNA testing of an important piece of evidence were expected sometime in 1998 and might allow authorities to proceed with a prosecution. However, previous DNA test results expected in early 1997 were never announced, and no grand jury was called at that time. 2 major books on the murder were published during the spring and summer of 1998. Greentown by Timothy Dumas and Murder in Greenwich by Mark Furman. Furman's book, based on his own investigation and the leaked Sutton files, further intensified public scrutiny of the Skakel family. Dorthy Moxley, Martha's mother, continued to be involved, becoming a friend of Dominic Dunn. She was the first witness called to testify when the grand jury proceedings opened on July 10th. The first witnesses called that day were Dorthy Moxley, John Moxley, Sheila McGuire, Gene Walker, and Dan Hickman. Dan Hickman testified about his observations when he first saw Martha's body beneath the tree, stating that he saw the broken golf club in the victim's body. Later testimony included Reverend Mark Connolly, family friend and advisor to the Skakels, and Mildred Eakes, Skakel neighbor and friend. In September, the website marthamoxley.com went online. By November, the grand jury had interviewed more than 30 witnesses in connection with the case. Many of these witnesses were reportedly former residents and staff of the Elon School in Poland Springs, Maine. These witnesses would later testify at trial about statements Michael Skakel allegedly made immediately after Martha Moxley's murder, implicating himself in the crime. Counsel for Michael Skakel, headed by defense attorney Michael Sherman, filed a motion in November to suppress all testimony from staff and residents of the Elan School, citing doctor-patient confidentiality. Sherman later claimed Michael's acute physical ailments precluded him from appearing before the grand jury in Bridgeport Courthouse. Michael Skakel's interview with author Richard Hoffman in 1997 regarding his autobiography, presumably released publicly in 1998, further detailed his changed alibi. Michael claimed that on the night of the murder, he returned home, was horny, and went out to spy on a woman on Walsh Lane. He claimed he couldn't get it up, so he went to the Moxley house, climbed a tree, and masturbated. As he left, he described feelings of panic and worry that someone had seen him jerking off. The grand jury utilized its subpoena power to compel testimony, leading to legal battles over confidentiality. On March 11, 1999, Suffolk County Judge Michael Mullen ruled that private investigator Willis Krebs must appear before the grand jury in Bridgeport. Krebs was a Sutton Associates investigator who had conducted interviews with Michael Skakel, during which Michael changed his alibi. On March 24th, Willis Krebs appeared before the grand jury. Krebs refused to divulge names on the basis that the information was confidential, but he was later ordered to do so. Former suspect and Skakel family tutor Ken Littleton was subpoenaed and appeared before the grand jury. Littleton initially refused to testify, invoking his Fifth Amendment privilege. After negotiations with his lawyer, Eugene Riccio, State Attorney Jonathan Benedict asked a Superior Court judge to compel Littleton to testify, granting him immunity from prosecution for any crime in the Moxley case, except for perjury in his testimony. Littleton testified for an hour and a half. The contents of his testimony were not made public, but it was hoped he testified about the Skakel House events on October 30th and 31st, 1975, and his suspicion of Michael, particularly his belief that the murder occurred after 10:30. Littleton shook Jonathan Benedict's hand and said, "Thank you," upon leaving the courtroom. The immunity deal officially cleared Littleton of suspicion. On September 9th, Rushton Skakel Sr., Michael's father, spent over an hour answering a grand jury's questions about what he might know concerning his son's possible involvement in Martha's murder. Rushton Skakel had also been subpoenaed to testify. His attorney, Michael Sherman, claimed that Rushton's acute physical ailments precluded him from appearing, but he did ultimately testify. The grand jury officially ended its investigation on December 10th. By law, Judge Thim had a maximum of 3 6-month terms, 18 months total, to complete his investigation. His final term ended on that date. Judge Thim had 60 days following the conclusion of the grand jury to submit a report stating whether he believed there was sufficient evidence to make an arrest. The prosecutor's office was not bound by the judge's recommendation. By the end of 1999, the grand jury had gathered substantial testimony, including that of Michael Skakel's cousins, former neighbors, Elon's staff, and the Skakel patriarch. The investigation that had begun 24 years earlier was moving toward a definitive decision. The changed alibis, the troubling statements at Elon, the witnesses who came forward, all of it was building towards something that had seemed impossible for decades: an arrest in the murder of Martha Moxley. The process began immediately following the conclusion of the one-man grand jury investigation in December 1999. The grand jury concluded there was sufficient evidence to indict Michael Skakel. In January 2000, Michael Skakel was arrested. He was 39 years old. He surrendered to Greenwich police. At his arraignment that March, Skakel maintained his innocence, famously telling Martha Moxley's mother, "You've got the wrong guy." Because Michael Skakel was 15 years old at the time of the 1975 murder, his case initially went to juvenile court. If convicted as a juvenile, he would have faced a maximum sentence of 4 years. The juvenile court heard further evidence regarding the disposition in October. A supervisor in the juvenile probation department testified that the Department of Children and Families was unable to meet the programmatic treatment or residential needs of delinquent persons committed to their care beyond the age of 18. The supervisor concluded that there were no dispositional alternatives available for Skakel in the state of Connecticut. Skakel's case was transferred to adult court a year later. By mid-2001, the case progressed to the Superior Court, where Judge John Kavanewski Jr. ruled that there was enough evidence to proceed to trial. The legal decision to try Skakel as an adult rather than a juvenile extended the severity of the potential sentencing. During pretrial motions, Skakel's defense announced an alibi for the night of the murder. The trial proceedings took place over several months in Norwalk Superior Court. Jury selection began on April 2, 2002. It was completed 3 weeks later, on April 24th, securing a panel of 12 jurors and 4 alternates. Testimony began on May 7th. The prosecution's case relied heavily on testimony from former classmates, mostly from the Elon School, who claimed Skakel confessed to the murder. The prosecution claimed Skakel killed Moxley in a jealous rage because his brother had fucked his girlfriend. The prosecution used testimony that Michael Skakel said he did not know if he had killed Martha or if his brother had killed her. Another person recalled Michael saying that if he killed her, he was not in his normal state. Evidence included Martha's diary, which detailed the sibling rivalry and Michael's erratic behavior, noting Michael kept telling me that I was leading Tom on, and I really have to stop going over there. The murder weapon, a golf club, was traced back to a set owned by Michael Skakel's late mother, Ann Skakel. On May 21st, the prosecution rested its case. A week later, on May 28th, the defense rested. Closing arguments were presented on June 3rd. During the final summation, the state used a multimedia presentation, including audio and photographic exhibits, to highlight evidence and inferences. This included playing excerpts from Michael Skakel's 1997 recorded interview with Richard Hoffman, juxtaposed with gruesome images of the victim's body. The state argued that Michael's recorded words about feeling panic while leaving the scene suggested first-hand experience. On June 7th, Skakel was convicted of murder. Michael Skakel stood to hear the Norwalk Superior Court jury foreman read his guilty verdict. When judicial marshals stepped forward to handcuff him, his brother, David Skakel, reached to lay a hand on his shoulder, but it was thrown off by a uniformed marshal. That August, Skakel was sentenced to 20 years to life imprisonment. He was assigned to the Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut. His 10-year marriage to Margot Sheridan Skakel, with whom he had a son, had ended the previous year. She had filed for divorce in 2000, shortly after his arrest. 27 years after Martha Moxley was murdered beneath a tree on her family's property in Greenwich, Connecticut, someone had finally been held accountable. For Dorthy Moxley, who had spent nearly 3 decades seeking justice for her daughter, the verdict brought a measure of closure. But the legal battle was far from over. Quick break. Ads keep the show running, but if you want to skip them, the ad-free version's on Patreon for just $3 a month. Links in the show notes. And we're back. Thanks for sticking through that. Let's get back to it. In August 2003, a significant development occurred when Michael Skakel's defense received testimony from a former classmate, Gitano Tony Bryant. Bryant came forward alleging that 2 other men, Adolf Hasbrock and Bert Tinsley, had confessed to killing a girl on the night of Martha Moxley's murder. This testimony was immediately utilized by Skakel's defense team, who filed a motion for a new trial based on this evidence. Requests for a new trial based on this and other arguments were repeatedly denied throughout the Connecticut legal system. Michael Skakel remained incarcerated at the Garner Correctional Institution in Newtown, Connecticut, serving a sentence of 20 years to life imprisonment. Throughout the mid-2000s, the defense presented multiple appeals. These appeals focused on several claims of deficiencies in the original trial, including allegations of withheld evidence by prosecutors and ineffective assistance of counsel. A review of the trial published in a legal journal in 2004 analyzed the prosecution's use of visual persuasion and multimedia presentations during the trial, specifically in the closing argument. The state's use of multimedia included playing excerpts from Skakel's recorded interviews juxtaposed with visual evidence. Skakel's defense involved high-profile attorneys such as Theodore Olson, who became involved in petitioning the U.S. Supreme Court to hear Skakel's case. Ultimately, these efforts to petition the Supreme Court failed to reverse the conviction during this period. Skakel persisted in claiming innocence throughout his time in prison. At a later sentence reduction hearing, Skakel spoke about his experiences, including the difficulty of being a father to his 13-year-old son while in prison. In response, John Moxley, Martha's brother, said Skakel was using his son as a shield in his arguments. Michael Skakel's brother, Stephen Skakel, continued to publicly state that his family fully supports his brother and believes he is innocent. The appeals continued through the end of the decade and into the next. In 2010, Skakel's defense attorney, Michael Sherman, pleaded guilty to tax evasion and served a year and a day in prison. State attorneys called a rebuttal witness in subsequent hearings to address claims that Sherman jeopardized Skakel's defense by failing to disclose $410,000 in pending liens placed on his property by the IRS and the state. The culmination of Skakel's legal appeals occurred in 2013. That year, Skakel's conviction was officially overturned by the courts. The conviction was overturned based on the finding that Skakel's trial attorney, Michael Sherman, had failed to adequately represent Skakel. The ruling cited ineffective assistance of counsel. This judicial finding of ineffective counsel led to Michael Skakel's release from incarceration pending further state appeals. He had spent 11 years in prison. For Dorthy Moxley and her son John, the overturn was devastating. After waiting 27 years for justice, they had finally seen someone convicted of Martha's murder. Now, just over a decade later, that conviction had been vacated. The legal battle that had consumed decades of their lives was not over. Michael Skakel remained free following the 2013 court decision that overturned his murder conviction, but the legal battles continued. The state was determined to fight the reversal, and the case remained in legal limbo. In July 2016, Robert F. Kennedy Jr., Skakel's cousin, published a book titled Framed: Why Michael Skakel Spent Over a Decade in Prison for a Murder He Didn't Commit. The book argued for Michael's innocence and framed his conviction as a miscarriage of justice. The following year, in September 2017, FX Productions optioned the rights to Kennedy's book to develop a multi-part television series. On February 17, 2018, officials stated they wanted Michael Skakel back in prison, fighting to reinstate the conviction that had been overturned. But on May 4th, the court vacated Michael Skakel's murder conviction and ordered a new trial. The following day, news outlets reported that the murder conviction of Kennedy cousin Michael Skakel had been overturned again. In June 2019, the Oxygen Channel premiered a 3-part documentary titled Murder and Justice: The Case of Martha Moxley, hosted by legal analyst and former prosecutor Laura Coates. The case remained in the public consciousness, a story of privilege, violence, and justice delayed. That same year, the U.S. Supreme Court declined to hear Connecticut's appeal to reinstate Michael Skakel's conviction. This ruling left the case unresolved, with no clear path forward for prosecutors. By 2020, the state of Connecticut announced it would not retry Michael Skakel. The decision cited insufficient evidence to pursue further prosecution. After 45 years, the case was effectively closed. No one would be held accountable for the murder of Martha Moxley. In August of that year, Crime Junkie released a podcast episode on the murder, adding to the extensive media coverage that had kept Martha's story alive for decades. In 2023, Michael Skakel filed lawsuits against individuals and entities involved in his prosecution. He sued the lead police investigator in the case and the town of Greenwich, alleging malicious prosecution and violation of his constitutional rights. The man who had spent 11 years in prison for murder was now seeking damages for his conviction. In 2025, Michael Skakel spoke publicly for the first time about the case in an NBC News podcast series called Dead Certain. He shared his perspective and reflected on the decades shaped by the murder case and its impact on his life. During the interview, he discussed details of the evidence, presenting himself as a man wrongly accused, a victim of circumstances and prejudice. But this case was never really about Michael Skakel. It was about Martha Moxley. Martha was 15 years old when someone killed her beneath a tree on her family's property in Belle Haven. She was vivacious and creative, a girl who played violin and piano, who excelled at drawing and painting, who kept a diary and wrote letters to distant friends. She was popular and self-confident, a conscientious student who tutored classmates in Spanish. She was the kind of person people described as easy, someone who made friends effortlessly and brought light into rooms. She had moved to Greenwich just over a year before she died. She was still adjusting, still making her place in a new community. She had a boyfriend, Peter Zaluka. She had her art projects and her cat, Tiger. She had her whole life ahead of her. On the night of October 30th, 1975, someone took all of that away. Someone beat her to death with a golf club, leaving her body beneath the pine tree where 15-year-old Sheila McGuire would find her the next day. The investigation that followed was bungled from the start. Evidence contaminated, leads ignored, witnesses not properly interviewed. The Greenwich Police Department was overwhelmed, and the Skakel family's wealth and connections created barriers that proved insurmountable. For Dorthy Moxley, the decades after Martha's death were defined by the search for justice. She lost her husband David in 1988. She moved from Greenwich to Annapolis, trying to build a new life while carrying the weight of her daughter's unsolved murder. She doubled rewards, hired attorneys, pushed investigators, gave interviews, attended hearings. She lived to see Michael Skakel arrested, tried, and convicted. She lived to see that conviction overturned. She lived to see the state decline to retry the case. Dorthy Moxley died on December 24, 2024, at the age of 92. She never got the closure she sought. The case that consumed her life ended without resolution, without anyone definitively held accountable for her daughter's death. Martha Moxley has been gone for 50 years. She never got to finish high school. She never went to college, never pursued a career, never fell in love, never had children. She never got to become the person she might have been. Her life was reduced to a crime scene, a court case, a series of appeals, a story told and retold in books and documentaries and podcasts. But before she was a victim, she was a person. She was Martha, a girl with talent and dreams and a future that stretched out before her like an open road. She deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just for how she died or who may or may not have killed her. In the end, that's what matters most.